Hey guys, today I'm going to show you how I create the perfect bezel. I'll walk you through my best tips and techniques that I use that have worked for me. Now before I dive in, I do want to mention that I'm entirely self-taught. My methods might not be the most conventional approach, but they work for me. I encourage you to do your own research and embrace a bit of trial and error, and just remember that in the smithing world we all tend to do things a little bit differently. First things first, you need to choose the right bezel wire for your project. Here are two examples of common bezel wire that I use. I tend to switch between 26 gauge and 28 gauge, serrated and plain. Given these two gauges, I purchase various widths to have on hand for various projects. If you're just starting out, I do recommend playing with both serrated and plain because they are very different stone setting experiences. You can also experiment with different gauges, however, I have found that 26 and 28 give me the best result for my projects. You'll find that most wire labeled bezel wire on Rio is already fine silver. I don't recommend using sterling silver for your bezel because it's much harder to work with. Fine silver is soft and will give you the right amount of bend to curve around your stone. All the tools that you'll see me using today are linked in the video description, and you'll also find direct links by visiting my Amazon storefront. I recommend using a rubber bench block. You're going to need flush cutters, flat nose pliers, and a pen. I'll be working with this white buffalo turquoise cabochon. It has a nice thick flat backing, but the top is pretty uneven, so I will show you how I work with that. The most important part of making your bezel is choosing the right wire. You want to make sure the bezel wire is tall enough to reach the dome of your cab so it creates just enough lip over the curve of the stone. When I wrap the wire around the stone, I want to make sure it's snug but not overly tight. I'll use my pen to mark where the two ends overlap. I use my flush cutters to make a cut as straight as possible. Now I like to use my pliers to then check the size of the bezel wire against the stone. Sometimes this takes a little maneuvering and you want to make sure that your bezel wire doesn't get too warped. I prefer my bezel to have a little bit of room around the stone like this. Now, in order to get a perfect solder joint, these two ends need to be perfectly flush against each other. Each end should already be fairly straight, so just a slight filing with my mini file should do the trick. But be careful not to over file here, as you can make your bezel too small by doing so. In order to create a perfect join here before you start soldering, you need to create a little bit of a tension between the two ends. You want to make sure every angle of your bezel is going to be in alignment before you start soldering. That looks perfect. There are multiple ways that you can solder your bezel, but I like to use the pick soldering method. When soldering the bezel, you want to use the smallest flame possible and use quick and even heat around the bezel to avoid melting it. Fine silver will quickly overheat and melt if you linger too long, and you just want to use a small piece of hard solder. So it definitely didn't come out perfect, but that's a good thing because now I can show you how I get rid of these imperfections. I'm going to first make sure the bezel still fits my stone. I like to use my pliers to do this, however, you want to be gentle so you don't overwork the wire and weaken it. As I showed you earlier, this stone lays flat, but it's super uneven on the surface. So you can see where there's more overlap on certain sides. And in order to even this out, I need to gently file away the excess in these areas only. I'm going to mark those areas with my Sharpie and gently use my mini flat file to sand them down. You want to keep checking your work against your stone to see how much more you have to file. You'll notice that sanding this way creates a lip on the top of your bezel. To smooth it out, I like to use my mini round file. And don't forget to save your silver dust. After taking my time sanding the bezel down, I want to check every angle of the uneven stone to make sure the lip remains even. I think that looks great, so now I'm going to take some sandpaper and just even out the bottom surface slightly. Make sure you sand at the bottom only. Now the last step to your perfect bezel is to clean up the solder puddle. I'll be using my flex shaft and this black silicone wheel to clean up the excess solder. You want to be really focused in this one area and be gentle because you don't want to stress your bezel out too much that it becomes weak. As you can see, that solder seam has completely disappeared. I'm super happy with this bezel, but we're not going to know how I did until we set the stone. So let's fast forward to that part. Okay, so we're ready to set the stone. I like to use my steel burnisher just to widen the bezel slightly. Now that is the sound you want to hear. Let's try it again. One of the most important things to note when making your bezel is that less is more. The more you do to your silver, especially fine silver, the more you're going to weaken it. You won't realize how weak your bezel is until you're at the final stage of your piece, so it's important to be gentle throughout and to not overwork your wire. So as you can see, I was able to modify the bezel enough to work with the uneven surface of the stone so that there's an even amount of the silver bezel to hold the cab in. The stone is completely secure, yet not overshadowed by the bezel. And now I'm going to show you guys the very last step to perfecting your finished bezel, and that is one last sweep with the silicone wheel. I prefer to use the blue one, and I've noticed that this step is crucial for finishing the perfect bezel. You want to just lightly use the wheel on the very edge of the bezel without touching your stone as much as possible. This is going to create a smooth surface and really seal in the stone within your bezel. This is where you can also buff out any scratches or anything else that might have occurred while you were working. And that's how I make the perfect bezel. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and let me know what other videos you want to see in the comments.